that shut down. He bounced around to various jobs and finally landed a position at Packard Electrics, which makes electrical components for GM cars. That was sold off to Delphi in the late 1990s. Meanwhile, his wife also got a job at Packard, and she transferred to Delphi. He said by the time, though, that Packard was bought up by Delphi and then spun off by GM about 10 years or so ago, the industry was in deep trouble because of NAFTA. He said we just couldn't compete anymore. You know, the jobs were moving south, where the wages are lower, where the regulations are fewer. These American jobs were all fleeing. So by 2005, Delphi is completely in bankruptcy, and they filed for bankruptcy. And so a couple of years after this, they finally strike a deal with the union that he's in, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. And they offer them this deal. It's stay at Delphi, and your wages get cut in half from $28 to $14 an hour. You lose most of your benefits, and your pension also gets cut. Or you can jump ship to GM and essentially keep everything intact. Meanwhile, his wife, who had risen into lower management at that point, was forced into retirement, and her pension was cut in half from $3,000 to $1,500 a month. So Chuck Sr. says to me, well, that was a no-brainer. Of course, you know, we were going to jump ship to GM. So they go to a GM. Go to work at the Lordstown factory that makes the Chevy Cruze in 2008. And when they get there, they find no one had bothered to tell them that their 20, 30 years of plant time didn't count for anything. So in other words, you had these workers who are in their 40s and 50s. They find themselves working at the bottom of the assembly line, trying to keep up with 20-year-old workers. And Chuck says to me, you know, I've worked hard my whole life. I've taken off only 5 weeks in 35 years of work. But you know, we're no spring chickens, and it's hard to keep up on the line when you're in your 50s. Within about a year or so, he was in excruciating pain. Basically, he had carpal tunnel syndrome in both hands from repetitive stress injuries. He goes on disability, he has surgery on both hands, endures about a year of recuperation, and he tried to go back this summer to work. And he said, within about 2 months, I was in excruciating pain, and they're telling me that I should be lucky to have a job, that I should just grin and bear it. And Chuck said, Wall Street, they don't care. All they care about is the almighty dollar. They don't care about the American worker. And he says, I want to work hard. You know, that's what I've done my whole life, but I can't anymore. And that's why Chuck said, I told my son to join the Occupy movement, and that's why my wife and I have joined the Occupy movement. And for us, this in many ways encapsulated what the Occupy movement is about. It's finding people like these in the most unexpected of places, people who you would never think would get involved in a movement that's derided as radical, a bunch of dirty hippies, violent anarchists, etc. Of course, none of it's really true. But people are finding, even in a time of despair, hope in this movement because there's, simply put, just a lot of suffering out there. Now, Chuck Hedring Sr. and his family, they're still middle class. They're scraping by, but they haven't fallen into poverty. Now, on the other hand, when we were in Boise, Idaho, we met Cindy Tiferet. And she was at the occupation. She was wearing a green cap of a legal observer, an elegant middle-aged woman. And we started talking to her, and she started telling us her story. Basically, in 2008, her husband, who's a lawyer, as the economic downturn hits the economy, she loses her job working at a bank, at a local bank, and her husband's law practice goes on the skids. Their income falls from $90,000 a year to $20,000 a year. Cindy has 4 adult children, and with her husband Brian, they have 2 teenage children. Boise, Idaho also had one of the biggest housing bubbles in the last decade. And so quickly they find themselves underwater and unable to meet their mortgage. They keep trying to pay on it, they get into one of the mortgage programs, but they're still unable to keep up with the payments. So finally, they just have to walk away from their home. And now they're living in the attic with their children, with some relatives, making $20,000 a year for a family of 4. And this is essentially the reality that's going on in America today. That you see this divide, one between people who have been completely forgotten, the poor, the homeless, the destitute. There's, by official statistics, there's about 50 million people in poverty. But according to these statistics, poverty means that a family of 3 can live on $19,000 a year. I'm not sure how one person is supposed to live on $19,000 a year, much less 3 people. So if you use more adjusted statistics that looks at what a living wage is, what it shows is essentially about 100 million Americans live in poverty, 1/3 of the population. And there are about then another 50 million, according to a recent report by the Associated Press, who are on the cusp of poverty. So here we have the richest nation in human history, the vast concentration of wealth in this society. The top 0.01%. These are the richest households, people who own at least $30 million of investable assets, have $17 trillion in liquid assets. That could completely wipe out the deficit. So when you hear all the talk about, oh, we're poor, we're bankrupt, we don't have enough money, of course that's not true at all. There's plenty of money in this country. It's a question of politics and in terms of how this money is concentrated, how it has been concentrated over the last 30 years, and what use it's put towards. So there's a commonality of suffering that we've seen around the country as we go from occupation to occupation. We meet veterans at many occupations. We met this woman who called herself Spiral. She was about 24 years old, an Iraq War veteran. She was living at Occupy Philadelphia, and she had been staying there instead of staying in her family's house, 3 generations. In her family's house. They were essentially living off their grandmother's pension. Her mother was ill, her father was a shoe salesman and was barely getting a minimum wage. And she is a war veteran. And you can imagine if we're talking about this as how war veterans get treated, how the rest of Americans get treated. So, like I said, this economic crisis is now in its 5th year. By official statistics, the unemployment rate is 8.6%. But when we look at the real unemployment rate, when we look at discouraged workers, people who've been forced into early retirement, youth who've never been able to enter the workforce, people who want full-time jobs or permanent jobs and can't get them, the real unemployment rate is about 20%. Now, during the Great Depression, it was about 25 to 30% at various times. So that should make us pause and think that this is essentially, we're in another Great Depression. And part of what we hear every day that, oh, we're actually, you don't even hear the word recession used anymore. It's all about, well, we're in recovery now, you know, and we may possibly go into recession. But the truth is, this is exactly how the Great Depression worked at all. It wasn't as if there was one severe ongoing downturn. There were ups and downs for over a decade, and we're basically in this pattern because we are now in its 5th year. And what it's actually resulted in is an even greater concentration of power and wealth. And that's where the slogan, the 1%, comes from, that there is this small slice of society. Now, the slogans, the 1%, the 99%, they're very powerful emotional ideas. They're not actually very strong analytical categories in terms of actually describing who really owns the money in this country. The 0.1% owns almost about half the wealth in this country, and then it's the 0.01% who really have most of the economic and political power in this country. So, but with this concentration of wealth that has been going on for really about 40 years now, has also come the political concentration of power. And this is where the Occupy movement really starts to come from. And we hear it when people say to us that I feel like I don't have a voice. I have no control over my life. My hands are tied. I have no say in the political process. And also in Youngstown, Ohio, we met Karen Joseph, 59, mother of 2 children. She was at the occupation, and incidentally, one of her sons was involved in Occupy Dayton, Ohio, and the other son was involved in Occupy Philadelphia. And it was remarkable, you know, just kind of as middle class as you can be, and yet the family was involved in all these different occupations. And she said it's a matter of human dignity, and I think this is something very fundamental. That people know that they're suffering economically, but they also feel beaten down socially and psychologically. Karen said, we just want to be treated like human beings, and they don't think we're human beings. Ashley Hansinko is a woman I met who actually worked for J.P. Morgan Chase in Dallas in their home mortgage department. And she said basically the mess that she was encountering there every day compelled her to fly to New York in early October. She took her vacation and flew to New York to spend a week at Occupy Wall Street. And again, this was something remarkable. You know, when you go on vacation, it's because you're supposed to do something enjoyable, something that'll give you this great memory. And we found multiple people doing this across the country, people taking their vacations. And this really speaks to the power of the movement, of the Occupy movement, that it really gives people a deep meaning, especially in a way that you can't get through consuming, through going on a cruise, through going to some beach or some resort. People are going, spending their vacations at occupations.